Will the New York Mets be in the market for any of the top relief arms this offseason? I'll break it all down on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. This offseason, the topic I've been asked about the most, I think, from our audience is relievers, the Mets bullpen. Who are they going to target? I've had so many of you ask me, Ryan, when are you going to do a show about the Mets bullpen? I've always said the same thing. It is such a volatile market to try to predict that I've sort of shied away from it, but we're going to try to tackle it today. And the first way we're going to do that is look at what's in-house. And if you look at the Mets roster, it's presently constructed. They have a lot of roster spots that are going to go to starting pitchers. Now, you can expect maybe at least one of these guys to be hurt. That's just sort of the nature of spring training. But if they're all healthy, you will see Kodai Senga, Sean Manaea, Frankie Montas, David Peterson, and Clay Holmes in the Mets opening day rotation. And you would probably see one of Griffin Canning or Paul Blackburn in that sixth spot, with the other guy as a swing man or a long man in that bullpen, potentially both of them as long men. And they sort of just figure out that sixth day, and at times you might have enough off days to give Kodai Senga enough rest where you don't need to be in a six-man rotation, but the Mets will revert to that sixth man a lot throughout the season. All of those guys will be on the roster. The only one of them that has an option is David Peterson, and I just don't see David Peterson in Syracuse this next season unless he's rehabbing from an injury. Tyler McGill also has an option, and I do expect him to start the season in AAA just because he's the one guy they can option outside of Peterson, of course. Griffin Canning and Paul Blackburn, they don't have options, so they will be on the roster unless they are hurt or traded. With that said, that's 7 spots out of 13. Then you add in Edwin Diaz, who's obviously going to be on the roster, and then Jose Butto does not have any more options. So you can't send him to Syracuse without DFAing him, and I don't see the Mets doing that. So Jose Butto likely right back in the bullpen, probably one of the late inning relievers at this point, and you hope that he can look a lot more like the version of himself that we saw throughout the regular season, as opposed to the guy that seemed to sort of shrink when the moment got big in October. That brings you to 9 out of 13, and that's not even taking into account Sean Reed-Foley, Danny Young, or Dylan Covey, who are all on the 40-man roster and do not have options. Are they all going to make the team? Of course not, but right now, they would all have to make the team, otherwise you lose them. So it really shows you how much these options can shrink. You have Reed Garrett, who I would expect to make the team. He should be on the roster. He still has an option, so if he has a bad camp, he could be sent down. I just wouldn't anticipate that. And then you have Daniel Nunez, who I would think would make the roster, assuming he's healthy after he had his season end a little bit early with that flexor strain. So if Nunez is available and he's pitching like we saw at the end of last season, he would figure to be a late inning option for the Mets. So if you add Garrett and Nunez in there, all of a sudden that's 11 out of 13 spots locked up, not counting, again, Sean Reed-Foley, Danny Young, or Dylan Covey. And Sean Reed-Foley was good last year when he was healthy. Danny Young had his moments, and we'll see. We'll see if those guys can earn a job. You also have other pitchers on the 40-man roster that have options, but could certainly make the team. Huascar Brazaban did not pitch well with the Mets last year, but he pitched pretty well with the Marlins. He has had an issue getting to camp on time due to visa issues when he was with the Marlins. So we'll see if the Mets have that ironed out, where he'll be available at the start of camp to try to make a job, or try to make the team, I should say. Tyler Zuber is another one the Mets acquired at the deadline last year. He has an option. Max Kranick made the wild card roster for the Mets. He's got an option. Kevin Herget and Justin Hademan, I believe both of them were acquired this offseason. They're on the 40 with options. So that is sort of the macro view of where the Mets are at. There's obviously other arms they've brought in this offseason already on minor league deals, and they'll bring on more guys where they'll get invited to camp and they'll see who will make the mix. But ultimately, I think David Stearns really does believe in just quantity and getting a bunch of different guys with a bunch of different pitch mixes and seeing what works, seeing what looks funky in camp, and trying to find the best 7 guys, I guess, if you got a 6-man rotation that will make the roster. Last year, the Mets waited until the very end of the offseason before they really started to strike on the relief market. They did sign Jorge Lopez early. They then later signed Adam Ottavino, Jake Diekman, and Shintaro Fujinami. Fujinami was able to be optioned. The other 3 guys made the team, but Jorge Lopez and Jake Diekman both got cut in the middle of the season. Adam Ottavino held the spot until the playoffs, but then was not on any playoff rosters. So you look at the signs they made last year, they really didn't work, honestly. The Mets got a lot more out of those under-the-radar guys that were able to find a ton of success, like a Reed Garrett, like a Sean Reed Foley, like Daniel Nunez, like Jose Butto, who pitched to a 2.0 ERA out of the bullpen in 36 innings. Nunez pitched to a 2.31 ERA in 35 innings. Sean Reed Foley pitched to a 1.66 ERA in 21 2/3. He just couldn't stay healthy. And then Reed Garrett led the Mets bullpen in innings pitched at 57 1/3. He pitched to a 3.77 ERA. Edwin Diaz had a rough year, but still a 3.52 ERA. A lot better than I think people will remember that season. Also, if you look at his xFIP, which is expected fielding independent pitching, a stat that sort of tries to isolate pitcher value and what a pitcher should be. So you sort of look at an xFIP and say, that's what their FIP should be, and FIP tries to take out defense. So fielding independent pitching, kind of what a pitcher's ERA should be based on just what they're bringing to the table. That would have shaved a run off of what his ERA was. So the analytics would tell us that Edwin Diaz is going to be better next season. I really think shaking off the rust, he will be. You look at what the Mets bullpen did last year, I think we remember it being awful. They were 17th in Major League Baseball in ERA, 12th in FIP, which is fielding independent pitching. Again, xFIP, they were actually 5th. A lot of that probably carried by Edwin Diaz and the fact that his xFIP was so much better than his actual FIP. They were 26 in the innings pitched. That's a testament to their starting pitchers, but they led Major League Baseball in strikeout per 9, 10.61 strikeouts per 9 as a team. The only team in Major League Baseball that has strikeout per 9 rate in the double digits. But look at their walk rate. They were 3rd worst in Major League Baseball. So that's something you would think they would like to clean up. You want to keep those strikeouts, and sometimes, of course, a lot of strikeouts leads to a lot of walks when you're chase and swing and miss. But if you can maybe bring those 2 numbers a little bit closer together, maybe you are at the top of the league in strikeout per 9, but you're in the top 10, and instead of being at the absolute bottom of the barrel when it comes to walks, maybe you're somewhere closer to the middle of the pack, and you're more effective as a bullpen overall. The bottom line here, when you look at the Mets bullpen, they currently have Edwin Diaz, Reed Garrett, Daniel Nunez, and Jose Butto that I would say are locked in relievers that you would expect to pitch in leverage. But 3 of those arms are still unproven guys coming off their lone season, really doing it at the big league level. So I do think there should be a focus, an emphasis on getting some veteran relievers that have experience pitching at the end of games. But if you look at the track record in free agency, it's not always a pretty picture when it comes to signing guys to big deals. I want to talk about that in the next segment here. Does it actually make sense for the Mets to spend at the top of the market when it comes to their bullpen? We'll go through that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Rocket Money. Does Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I was so frustrated when I realized how many subscriptions I had that I just wasn't even using and still paying for them. Rocket Money made it so easy for me to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel unwanted subscriptions, monitor your spending, and help you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's those subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users that have saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on today. That's rocketmoney.com/locked-on. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 12,000 subscribers. Appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Last year, there were 11 relievers who were signed for $6.5 million or more. We're calling this the Phil Maton line because Phil Maton was the reliever that got that $6.5 million guaranteed for the 2024 season. Looking back, I also should actually note, Jordan Hicks, Ronaldo Lopez, Nick Martinez all signed for more than that, but they all ended up being starting pitchers instead of relievers after previously working more out of the pen. So let's go through the 11 relievers who signed above the Phil Maton line or at the Phil Maton line. You had Josh Hader, top arm, obviously. He got the $95 million over 5 years from the Houston Astros. He pitched to a 3.80 ERA, had a disastrous start, came on a little bit stronger. Although, if I remember right, I think he had a blow up in the playoffs. It was underwhelming, though, certainly for the investment that the Astros made on Josh Hader. He did not live up to that deal, at least in year one. You had Craig Kimbrell, who got $13 million. He was great in the first half. I believe he was an all-star. He was a disaster and ended up getting cut in the second half. Robert Stevenson is an arm the Mets were very in on. He signed a 3-year, $33 million deal with the Angels. Never pitched, was hurt. David Robertson signed a 1-year, $11.5 million deal with the Rangers. He pitched to an even 3 ERA across 72 innings pitched. You had Aroldis Chapman, who got $10.5 million from the Pirates, pitched to a 3.79 ERA with a bunch of strikeouts. It's pretty solid, I think, overall for that investment. Hector Neris, another pitcher the Mets were in on last year, got $9 million from the Cubs, pitched to a 4.10 ERA. Matt Moore got $9 million. He pitched to a 5.03 ERA. Emilio Pagan got a 2-year, $16 million deal. He pitched to a 4.50 ERA. Joe Kelly got $8 million. He pitched to a 4.78 ERA. And then you have Jacob Junis, who got $7 million. He actually pitched to a 2.69 ERA, although a lot of that was low leverage. Phil Maton, the Phil Maton line, $6.5 million. He pitched to a 3.66 ERA overall, but in his 28 and 2/3 innings with the Mets in the regular season, pitched to a 2.51 ERA. Then in the playoffs, it's a little bit of a disaster. Overall, you look at those 11 deals that were signed for $6.5 million or more. So the top of last year's relief market. Only 4 of them hit. You had Maton, who hit more with his second team because the Rays traded him after he struggled with them a little bit. You have Junis that hit, but again, more low leverage, longer relief. Not a ton of strikeouts, did well, but he wasn't necessarily a late inning reliever last year. You had Aroldis Chapman and David Robertson, who I think hit based on, the expectations for them. Certainly Robertson did with the 3 ERA and pitching over 70 innings. Chapman, he still has the strikeout stuff, still has those moments where he's dominant. I would say he basically pitched to expectations. Craig Kimbrell hit, and then he didn't. That's why he's not one of the 4 that I would say hit out of those 11. Josh Hader will be fine, but again, pretty underwhelming season based on expectations. And you look at the 2 guys the Mets were in on to potentially spend more at the top of the market last year, Hector Neris and Robert Stevenson. Stevenson wasn't available, so that's not really on him or the Angels. But Neris was not good. So that doesn't necessarily paint the prettiest picture here for spending at the top of the market. It can work out for you. And we're going to talk about some arms in the next segment that are certainly worth investing in. But a lot of times it's hitting on that guy that showed up to camp with the minor league invite that all of a sudden found something. The Reed Garrett story from last year, a guy that was on your roster that was acquired by Billy Epler off of waivers. I think it was after the trade deadline in 2023, and we saw a little bit of him, and all of a sudden Reed Garrett shows up with that splitter and the sweeper and everything he had working, and he was absolutely lights out in the Mets bullpen to start the year. He obviously went through some bumps and bruises along the way, but ultimately in the playoffs, that there was 3 arms that sort of delivered for the New York Mets. It was Edwin Diaz, it was Reed Garrett, and it was certainly Ryan Stanek, who signed, I think, for $4 million with the Mariners. That's another arm the Mets were in on during the offseason. He chose Seattle. The Mets got him at the deadline. He was a disaster in the regular season, pitched to an ERA over 6, but figured it out when it mattered most. So that's just what really is telling about the reliever market. You just never know. It can be month by month with guys. It can be week by week. It is so tough to predict. When the Mets signed Jake Diekman, we all applauded the move, and he was an unmitigated disaster. We all thought, oh, Adam Ottavino will be great, and when Diaz is back, he wanted to pitch, in so many stressful, we knew he was going to pitch in leverage, but a lot different than what we saw in 2023 when Diaz wasn't there and Adam Ottavino was tasked with closing at times. We thought, oh, they'll get more out of him this year. Didn't work. Shintaro Fujinami, we were all thrilled about. Oh, the guy throws gas. Can't wait to see him. Never saw him. So it really is so hard to figure out what a reliever is going to be. And I think the perfect example to me that just jumps out as far as my history as a Mets fan, what I remember most, I remember the offseason when the Mets signed Francisco Rodriguez. And let me see if I can figure, was it 2008? See if I can figure it out. But I remember they signed K-Rod, and then they went out and they traded for J.J. Putz in some crazy 3-team trade that had like a dozen people in it. And, J.J. Putz came from Seattle where he was a closer. And I remember we were all just so fired up by the idea of like, man, the New York Mets are going to have this bullpen that's going to be so much better than the year before. They finally have a real closer in Francisco Rodriguez. They have a real setup man in J.J. Putz. And I remember J.J. Putz was a disaster. I'm trying to look up. I feel like there was a third reliever too that I can't quite recall who it was. Maybe they were hoping for something like Bobby Parnell. I don't even know. I'm looking through the baseball reference from that year. I can't find the other name that jumps out for who else the Mets were expecting to get a lot out of. But again, it was certainly expecting to get J.J. Putz in that 8th inning, and he was going to be the guy. If you remember, was it Darren O'Day? No way. I don't know. If you remember who the other reliever the Mets were thrilled about as the 7th inning guy that year, because I swear there was another guy, please let me know in the comments, or if you're a texter, please shoot me a text over on subtext there. But the bottom line is I remember vividly how assured I was that the Mets were going to have a late inning situation that they could go to the bank with K-Rod and J.J. Putz. And it didn't work. You just never know if it actually is worth it to invest heavily in the relief market. With that said, there are some arms I love the Mets to get, and we're finally going to talk about them in the final segment. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks in the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways. If you want to be Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. All right, so if you look at the relief market right now, there's 3 names I think that are probably at the top of the market looking for multi-year deals. You have Tanner Scott, who's clearly the best reliever on the market. You have Jeff Hoffman, and it's been reported that he is looking to start potentially. So I don't think he's going to come to the Mets. They already got one of those guys in Clay Holmes. And then you have Carlos Estevez, who's coming off a year where he pitched to a 2.45 ERA. He's 32 years old. This might be the last time he gets a multi-year deal. But the strikeout rate, not the highest. I don't really look at him as the type of reliever the Mets would potentially target. So I don't think he's an answer here. The one guy of those 3 that obviously gets you excited is Tanner Scott, because the Mets don't have a left-handed reliever they can go to and trust. And Tanner Scott would be the absolute epitome of getting a lights-out lefty that can be the setup man to Edwin Diaz. In 2023, he pitched to a 2.31 ERA for the Miami Marlins across 78 innings pitched. He saved 12 games. Opened up 2024 as their closer, saved 18 games, pitched to a 1.18 ERA. That's how you get yourself off a bad team. Gets traded to the Padres. ERA did tick up. He pitched to a 2.73 ERA in 26 and a third innings pitched, added 4 more saves. But when it came to nut crunch time for the Padres, you saw Tanner Scott was the answer, was the Shohei Ohtani neutralizer That's what he could be for the New York Mets. The guy that can go to when the top of the lineup is coming up in the 8th inning and you're looking at Ohtani and Freeman in the on deck to hit list going in there. You say, all right, well, we got Tanner Scott that's going to neutralize those guys where you don't have to go to Edwin Diaz in that 8th inning, or when Bryce Harper's coming up in the 7th with a man on second base and 2 outs, and you could call on Tanner Scott to get the final out of the 7th and go back out there and maybe get 3 more outs in the 8th, hand the ball off to Edwin Diaz. Tanner Scott is the guy the Mets should absolutely be in on, but he's going to get paid the most. Not to say the Mets can't shop in that market. They can't get the top tier reliever, but it doesn't feel like that would be David Stern's MO to shoot to the top of the market. Maybe this is the reliever that's the exception. And I don't know what he's going to get. I don't think he's going to get near the $95 million that Josh Hader got as the top reliever on last year's market, because Josh Hader had a longer track record of being this elite closer. Tanner Scott, you're looking at the last 2 years. I think it's probably something like $60 million over 4 years, and the Mets should absolutely be in on that. You got Steve Cohen's money. You shouldn't be shy about spending it, and I really look at Tanner Scott, and I think that investment would pay off more than even potentially getting that second bat that we talked about on yesterday's show. Like, yes, it'd be amazing if the Mets signed Pete Alonso. Well, it depends where the second bat is. If the second bat's Anthony Santander, I think that's going to provide more value. Jurickson Profar, if he's who he was last year, that'd provide more value. But if you're talking about who's more valuable to spend on, Jesse Winker or Tanner Scott, like, there's no question. And even if the middle ground is Jurickson Profar, I can make the case that as long as the Mets get one of Pete Alonso or Alex Bregman, I might even say I'd rather they spend on Tanner Scott and then maybe even bring in Jesse Winker over spending a little bit more for a Jurickson Profar, because I just think there is something to be said about having another top-end reliever that's going to be able to throw fuzz like Tanner Scott can, that can give you an alternative to Edwin Diaz, or Edwin does not have to do it himself. When you get to the playoffs, Edwin Diaz isn't coming out there in the 5th inning trying to get 9 outs. I mean, it was crazy the way they had to rely on Edwin Diaz in the playoff run, and at times it wasn't even pretty, but he was the only guy that you really, really could go to the bank with. The hope would be Tanner Scott could be that. And I really do. If it was my money, I would go for it. I don't know if the Mets are going to be on him, and I wish they were, but we'll see. There's been nothing I've really seen reported about who's in on Tanner Scott. And maybe that plays to the Mets' benefit, because maybe the market doesn't develop and it could be a 1 or a 2 year deal at an extremely high AAV that the Mets would be more excited to jump in on that. I don't think the money for 2025 would scare the Mets. I think the years would. I think that they'd prefer, like most teams, to shop in the bin of relievers that's going to sign the 1 year deal where, yes, it could be a big investment in a guy, but if it's like a Jake Diekman last year and it doesn't work out, you don't feel bad cutting the guy mid-season or moving on after the year like they did with Adam Ottavino. I think that's probably more likely where they're going to look, and that's where there's a couple more names I wanted to talk about today. So we're going to start here with another closer type. That's Kirby Yates. Kirby Yates was 33 for 34 in his save opportunities with the Rangers. He pitched to a sparkling 1.17 ERA in 61 2/3 innings pitched. Strikeout rate was strong, over 12 per 9. He will be 38 years old next year, but it's coming off a couple of really strong seasons, and last year was just unbelievable. So you get Kirby Yates to be your 8th inning guy. I think that would be a great signing, but does he want to keep closing after being the closer for the Rangers last year? If he does, and that's the role he's looking for, I don't think he's going to find that with the Mets. Instead, you can look at a guy that set up for him last year, David Robertson. Bring him back, man. I've said this on the show a lot. I want to see the Edwin Diaz, David Robertson bullpen we were promised in 2023 and never got. David Robertson became the Mets closer. He was exceptional. Got traded to the Marlins. Hated it. I don't know how much that bad memory still lives in David Robertson's brain if he actually would consider coming back to the Mets. But you know what? Give him a no-trade clause for all I care. Honestly, give him a no-trade. Why not? If that got David Robertson to sign, you get a guy that's just been so remarkably consistent throughout his career that you know he's going to have absolutely no issue pitching in New York. He's going to go about his business. He's going to be a good leader in the clubhouse for other guys in that bullpen, a guy that's done the job forever. He's perfect to me. He's the perfect fit. He will be 40 years old in April, so he's obviously on the back nine of his career, but the last 2 or 3 years, he has shown that he has plenty left in the tank and a guy that can be a workhorse for you too out of that bullpen. David Robertson is pretty high on my list of guys that like the Mets to target. Another option in this boat of older veterans that you can get on a 1-year deal that might be, around $10 million potentially. Chris Martin, 38 years old, or will be 38 years old next year. He had a 3.45 ERA this past season with a minuscule 1.7% walk rate. Just commands the strike zone. Had a good strikeout rate too of 27.8%. He's been very effective in Boston the last couple of years. I think he'd be a great fit. You sign Chris Martin, have him as your 8th inning guy, you're good to go. The other option to mention is still Ryan Stanek or Phil Maton. I wouldn't rule it out entirely. The Mets declined their club option, but I think that was to really wait out this market and see what deals they could find. Maton could come back to the Mets, and as much as we remember how poor he pitched in the playoffs, he was outstanding in the regular season. Ryan Stanek was the inverse of that. He was really great in the playoffs, and I think that's why Mets fans would prefer to see Stanek back. But it's funny because drastic difference in the regular season. I mean, Stanek was bad for a large portion of his tenure with the Mets until the lights turned on in October, and then all of a sudden he was awesome. So I think there's a chance the Mets do re-sign Stanek. I think that's probably the most likely of this group. But ultimately, the best arm they can get is Tanner Scott. And I would love it if they did. If not, I hope they maybe settle on one of these older relievers that can get on a 1-year deal, whether it's Kirby Yates, David Robertson, or Chris Martin. There's obviously a lot of other guys on the market they can go after. And I would anticipate the Mets continue to bring in guys on minor league deals with invites to spring training. And I imagine they'll probably sign 2 guys that I did not even talk about today, because that's just the nature of talking about the relief market. It is so hard to identify where the Mets might look, which arms will stand out to them. But if you're asking me who I want them to sign, Tanner Scott is clearly number 1 option for me. I then would say David Robertson or Kirby Yates, Chris Martin being another guy I like a lot. And I think bringing Stanek back is a wise move because it's probably not going to cost you a ton. Clearly worked in October, and I just like that playoff experience playing out for the Mets again, where maybe this time you don't have to trade for him. You just sign him to open things up, and I think you're going to have a guy that's throwing really hard at the end of games for you. It might not look great for stretches of the season, but he's a guy that can get right at the right time. And with a team that you expect to have World Series aspiration, that's what you want. You want guys that have been in October before, know how to pitch. They're not going to shy away from the moment. And I expect that's where they're going to really look in this market. If it's not Tanner Scott, expect it to be those veteran arms that have been there before, done it, and will sign on a 1-year deal. So that's my take on where the Mets are at right now with their bullpen. They probably need to add an arm or 2, and I expect they will. But don't expect a massive overhaul where they're signing like 4 or 5 relievers to major league deals. That's not how David Stearns operates. He's going to sign like 20 arms that are going to show up to camp competing for a spot or 2, and ideally guys that can be stashed in the minor leagues. So throughout the season with the churn and burn of a MLB bullpen, you're going to have a lot of guys cycling in and out, and eventually you hope to find the winning combination. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. Tomorrow's show, we'll see if we get any news that we can react to. Otherwise, we might switch gears a little bit and start to look towards the farm system or potentially projecting some seasons for some guys. We're getting closer and closer to spring training, so you can actually start to try to foreshadow what's ahead a little bit. But I will have a show for you all tomorrow, so make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you are watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to settex.com/LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. And for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.